Hi there, this is Sam Morshed again, and we're going to now talk about implementing your research and talk about some practical issues in taking your proposal to your protocol. The learning objectives of this presentation are going to be really practical issues around implementing your well-conceived study question that has become a good proposal, and now we'd like to roll that into actually actionizing, implementing and putting your proposal into action. It requires that we consider funding questions. We're going to talk a little bit about building your research team, trialing your protocol, troubleshooting your design, in order to identify problems that may arise, running your trial, and talking about some simple design or data management issues. So we're going to take a case example of a study that we've completed with our partners in Tanzania. It's a question that's stated as whether there's a difference in reoperation comparing external fixation to intramedullary nailing for open tibial fractures. We've defined a population of tibial shaft fractures, the intervention, a locked intramedullary nail, its comparator, which is an external fixator, and we're measuring outcomes that include primarily reoperation within the 1-year follow-up window, and secondarily functional and patient-reported outcomes, as well as clinical union and radiographic union. So in order to implement this study, we're going to need to figure out how to fund it. Doing prospective clinical research is not cheap, it's not free, and it requires that we get funding in order to bring about the resources that will be required to carry out the study. We need to determine an ideal budget. This is what I always like to do, is think about the ideal study that would definitively answer a question, and then from there begin to scale it back to the minimum feasible amount of funding that we need to implement a study that could answer our research question. We need to identify potential sources of funding. They may come from your institution, they may come from foundations or professional societies, and often the big ticket funders include government and sometimes NGOs. You want to cast the wide net and be persistent. It often means starting small and building your bank account with subsequent rounds of applications and grants for funding. Building a research team is incredibly crucial. If you're new to conducting research, it means identifying the right mentors, teachers, and the folks who are going to provide some guidance to you as you carry around about your research, identifying collaborators and partners, co-investigators, and importantly, research coordinators who will do a lot of the data collection, patient enrollment, and follow-ups. Most of us as busy clinicians just aren't able to be there and carry out every little step that it takes to get patients into our study and followed up appropriately. And identifying and hiring research coordinators is absolutely critical to carrying out and implementing your research. This is a research team that we built at the Muhimbili Orthopedic Institute in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. We had a group of 4 surgeons that were involved. We had 2 surgeons from UCSF, a resident, and several students that we had that were able to spend time visiting MOI. And we had a team of 3 research coordinators that we brought on almost 10 years ago now, that have continued to be a wealth of resource and have have become incredibly skilled research coordinators that really rival some of our teams here that we work with domestically. So this team was assembled about 10 years ago now, and has continued to work together on trial after trial. This particular research study that we conducted started with the development of our team in 2014. We proposed an initial round of grants for funding in 2015, which we were lucky enough to secure. We developed research protocols and what we call a manual of operations. We developed our case report forms, which are the forms that are completed with information on patients when they're enrolled and at each subsequent follow-up. We got human subjects approval towards the end of 2015, and were able to begin enrolling patients in 2016. Finished enrollment towards the middle of 2017. And completed final 12-month follow-ups in 2018, which allowed for analysis and completion of our initial manuscripts later in 2018. So this is what the study timeline looked like. It's something that you should begin to be thinking about even when you're proposing your research and writing your grants. Those are the sorts of things that funders are going to want to see to establish feasibility. Now, how do you screen and enroll patients? This is one of the most critical elements of operationalizing your research protocol, is really thinking through how new cases will be identified. When will screening be conducted, and by whom? This requires clinical expertise. Informed consent is a critical element in carrying out this work. You need to be able to establish protocols for confirming that informed consent is actually being conducted prior to enrollment and randomization of patients in your study. You need to have a good mechanism for gathering baseline data, including demographic information and treatment information, and establish a sequence within which treatment assignment is going to be randomized after patients have been properly screened and informed consent has been performed. Having a pilot or a run-in period in your protocol is really critical for making sure that it's feasible, that you actually are able to enroll the sorts of patients that you thought you'd be able to get from screening. Often this is a big difference, right? You may treat a lot of patients with a given condition, but you need to make sure that those patients can actually fully meet the inclusion criteria and are willing to participate in the work. You need to look at whether your randomization works, whether then randomization is truly concealed and is allocated properly. You need to see whether your study procedures are working. Are the ways in which you're implementing the surgical treatments that you might be randomizing patients to actually working as expected? Are there barriers to follow-up, and how can those be overcome? And data quality issues will certainly arise, and you need to be able to detect those and correct them in real time. So this is how the follow-up schedule for our patients enrolled in our open tibia trial looked like, right? And we need to make sure that we could get patients back at each of these predetermined follow-ups and gather the appropriate follow-up information, including imaging and patient-reported outcomes. You want to eliminate barriers for patients who are coming back to clinic. How do you do this? Well, we were able to create a dedicated research clinic, which required that we hire not just the coordinators who are going to come and gather the information, but also nurses, and making sure that one of our partnering attendings was able to staff that clinic. This requires building trust and relationships. How do we reduce costs to patients, right? Because if those patients are paying money to come and follow up. And that's a barrier. Often patients won't come back for follow-up visits because they're required to pay more. We would make those clinics free to patients to incentivize them to come, making any imaging studies that they would need at the time of those follow-up visits. Also making that free of charge for the patients so that they have an incentive to show up for their follow-up visits, and making sure that we were implementing technologies available to patients, including cell phones, making sure that they were getting called up or using SMS reminders. How do we get patients who are lost to follow-up back? Well, you collect a lot of information right at the get-go, right? Patient information. What are members of their families? If they live in a community, can they provide information on community leaders that can help us track these patients down? Narrative addresses, right? Sometimes patients may not have an actual street address, and so we need to get information documented that provides a narrative as to how one could find them. Not only where they live, but where they will recover from their injuries. Staying in touch by phone and identifying potential barriers as they come up, and considering transporting patients or providing them a stipend for transfer back if they're coming from a distance. Are there reasons why ways in which we may be able to leverage technologies like cell phone photos and telephone surveys that may be valid surrogates for the outcomes that we're interested in collecting on these patients? This is an example form that we used in one of our studies, which really shows all of the various parameters of identifying information that we collect on these patients, including narrative descriptions on where they live that you can see at the bottom. What do? Do we collect paper forms or go electronic? Well, we found out very early on that paper forms were really problematic at getting printers, filing these papers away. A lot of that paper could be done away with the emergence of high quality electronic data capture, which again helped us overcome the nightmarish chart storage process that you can see here in one of the medical records rooms at Muhimbili. All of our information was put on research laptops and uploaded to the cloud. This can be done at relatively low expense and allows for capture of both information that the coordinators are implementing on background, as well as patient-reported outcomes, which would go directly onto the research laptop and into the cloud, and imaging studies, which also could be uploaded directly to our electronic data capture system. We use a system called REDCap, which allows for free web-based data collection. It's widely available, completely customizable, password protected to the highest level of protection of human subjects' information, and is really become the gold standard for electronic data capture. It allows for randomization, follow-up scheduling, and real-time data reporting. How about data monitoring? We have to have a plan for how data will be stored and monitored. What are the intervals of analysis? Typically, we will do interim analyses every 6 months. We'll want to have a schedule and a customized way of reporting this data out to a data safety and monitoring board. We talked about that in one of the other lectures as a necessary safety measure for that's really now being required in most prospective clinical trials. This is an external body, again, that looks over. They're not affiliated with the study, and what they are doing is they are providing oversight and a separate set of eyes to make sure that patient safety and adverse event reporting are being appropriately conducted, that there may be certain stopping rules that are implemented a priori at the beginning of a trial that need to be monitored and checked for compliance over the course of the study. These sorts of data safety and monitoring boards need a feed of information from the trial, and one will want to make sure that those routines are being set up at the beginning of the trial to make sure that best practices are being followed. Adjudication. A final review of all study primary events or complications is really, really important. And this needs to happen iteratively over the course of a trial. You need to have an agreed upon set of parameters by which a study event, such as an infection or a reoperation, are adjudicated, and proper recording of outcomes is being followed by an adjudication process. The investigators will review events and develop a consensus as to whether a certain potential event that's being flagged on the follow-up forms counts as a primary event, right? For example, did a patient in fact have a fracture-related infection? If that happens to be our outcome of interest, sometimes ascertaining a fracture-related infection can be somewhat subjective. So adjudicators will want to get together, review the information, and ascertain whether the event is related to participation in the study or not. Same goes with adverse outcomes, right? Those are also events of interest. They need to be reported to the Data Safety and Monitoring Board. They need to be potentially reported to the human subjects review committees at participating institutions. These fall within the purview of an adjudication committee. And this is just a consort diagram that came from our published primary results from our randomized trial comparing intramedullary fixation to external fixators. You'll want to be able to send every patient in the study from the initial screening process into one of these final boxes in a form like this that is required now for publication of your results. So in summary, I know we've talked a lot about a lot of different subjects, and I think it's hopefully this slide brings it home for you. Remember funding and thinking creatively and iteratively about funding your research, how it must, it often comes from several different sources, and we kind of use smaller funds to build grants for bigger funding and so on and so forth until you gather the resources that you're going to need to carry out your research. Building a robust research team, really the people really, really, really matter. Finding the right collaborators, developing a team of coordinators that can safely, ethically, and diligently carry out your research. Trialing your protocol, identifying potential problems in your protocol before you roll out your larger clinical trial, and then tending to data management and quality control over the course of your study will get you to the point where you've got a high quality product for analysis and ultimate dissemination and publication of your findings. Remember to get those final follow-ups. They really, really matter. So we're coming towards the end of our kind of framework here that we've created, which started with an idea about a good study question that we were able to manicure in a way that allowed for a hypothesis that was actually testable, developing the right kind of proposal or protocol which implements all of the design features that we have in our toolbox, as well as analytical approaches, taking that proposal for research and taking it through to a protocol that we can implement, complete, and ultimately disseminate as valid answers to our original research question. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope you found this presentation informative.